Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. We're in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium here at the two Mississippi Museums. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. And I hope that you will be able to join us tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. We'll have the 4th annual Betty Jolly Lecture at the Eudora Welty House and Garden. You can join us for an afternoon in the garden with Alice McDermott, whose book Charming Billy won the American Book Award for Fiction. That event is free of charge, no reservations are required, and it is co-sponsored by our friends, the Eudora Welty Foundation, who really run that event. And I hope that you will all be able to join us here next week when we will have Charlie Spillers with us to present Confessions of an Undercover Agent, Adventures, Close Calls, and the Toll of a Double Life. Today, though, we are delighted to have Jean Dattel and Otis Sanford to present Reckoning with Race, the perspective of two native Mississippians. Jean Dattel was educated at Yale University and the Vanderbilt University Law School. He is the former managing director of Salomon Brothers and Morgan Stanley. His 2009 book, Cotton and Race in the Making of America, described the intersection of the power of cotton to the African American experience. Dattel's new book is Reckoning with Race, America's Failure. His forthcoming personal family essay, Jewish Immigrants from Eastern Europe to the Yazoo, Mississippi Delta, will be published by the New York Historical Society. Otis Sanford is the author of the new book, From Boss Crump to King Willie, How Race Changed Memphis Politics. He is a political commentator for WREG-TV Channel 3 and a panelist for Informed Sources, a weekly public affairs program. Sanford writes a weekly viewpoint column for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, and before joining the University of Memphis in 2011, where he holds the Hardin Chair of Excellence in Economic and Managerial Journalism, Sanford served as the Commercial Appeal's editorial page editor and managing editor, the first African American to hold those positions. Help me welcome Jean Dattel and Otis Sanford.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually a pleasure to be back in Jackson. It's where I started my journalism career professionally. I started as a 22-year-old straight out of Ole Miss at the Clarion Ledger. And I remember my very first day in May of 1975, walking into the Clarion Ledger newsroom, and my first assignment was to cover the Lawrence Welk concert at the Mississippi Coliseum. Lawrence Welk and his Champagne Orchestra. Just think about that analogy now. Here I am, black kid from Panola County, and I'm covering, first professional story is covering Lawrence Welk. But I have to say it was wonderful, wonderful. It was just wonderful.
First of all, congratulations to Mississippi for this already nationally acclaimed museum. And Otis,
Yeah.
Otis, oh. Is that better?
Better.
Otis and I were around during the 1960s, but we're not yet historical relics.
Right.
And I think you can see from these books behind us that we've had a lifelong interest in the subject matter, and we have begun to discuss this about 10 years ago in terms of the topics, and we are really glad to be able to present this to you. Both of us are from the private sector. He's a journalist, and I was in the financial area, so you're going to get a fair amount, a large component of the economic aspects of race at this point. But before that, we wanted to give you a little bit about our parallel lives growing up in Mississippi.
Right. And it's really interesting how Jean and I met. We actually met through his book, Cotton and Race, because I had been writing columns in the Commercial Appeal about a lot of racial issues, and people were arguing with me about, well, what caused the Civil War and what didn't cause the Civil War. So when I heard about Jean's book, it was really a godsend because it helped me make my case about the Civil War, and we talked, and matter of fact, I think I wrote a column about it, and that's how we struck up this friendship and relationship that's been going on for about 10 years. I grew up on a farm in Panola County, Mississippi. That's my farmhouse right there on your left. We had our own farm, though. We were not sharecroppers. My father, who only had a sixth grade education, was still an entrepreneur. My mother had some college. She went to Russ College and MI over in Holly Springs, and had been a school teacher before she stopped to raise 7 children, all of whom have college degrees. And they made sure that we understood that education was the key to getting off the farm, to getting away from the cotton fields, to getting off the plow, and we all took advantage of that because we didn't want to have anything to do with that going forward. Journalism was my route out of off the farm, and I'm appreciative of everything that's happened with my career that has spanned over 40 years, and both in the South and in the North, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Gene?
The picture on the right is about my family home, but it's really deceptive. This is a recent picture of my grandfather's house, which didn't resemble anything like that in the 1950s and 60s. It was just a snowstorm prevented me from getting the photo of the real house a few days ago. Now, this home was in Sunflower, Mississippi, a town of 500 people, and the house itself was on the banks of the Sunflower River. And I would go down as a kid and watch across the river the black baptisms. This was where my grandfather, who was the teenage Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe, settled. Town of 500 people. He had stores. My father and mother were there too, and we left Sunflower when I was very young because my older brother kept climbing out of the window of the one-room schoolhouse, which housed 1 through 6th grades. So we moved 10 miles away to Ruleville, Mississippi, town of 1,500 people, for the educational system.
Tell us about that, Gene.
Okay. Now, the typical Jewish profession was owning a store. This was our store in Ruleville, and this is a photograph from 1951, and you can see the people behind the cash register. This was a family affair. This was my great uncle, the large man, who was an immigrant with my brother. He was settled in Rosedale, Mississippi. There's my father and my mother, and this was a very, very typical store in the Delta, and you can't really see because it's not large enough. But the people in the back, this was an integrated event in a small town in Mississippi. And as you know, the small towns in Mississippi had a dividing line. If the town had stores only on one side of the street, it was small. Sunflower only had stores on one side of the street. Ruleville had stores on both sides of the street. So we had very much upgraded. The family was very close. Every time a member of the Dattel family started a store, the whole family would come to help them open it, whereas nobody else, none of these people other than my parents had any ownership in these stores. Saturday night, I liked working in those stores because it was active. And as you know, that's when the black farm labor came into town. So I would leave the store, walk around the block, and there were the Chinese grocery stores, the G's and the Tans. And on the end of the block was Mac's Cafe, which was the juke joint. And there were people milling around. You could talk to people. I then walked down the street with people who had been my customers in the store. We would chat. We would go to Eddie's Cafe, where I would walk in the front door. They would walk in the side door. And the counter that served us was bifurcated by a wall. that restaurant was owned by a Lebanese family. So you have this little melting pot in the Delta at that time.
Right. Yes, that's me. In 1957, standing on top of my father's truck. This is actually the Sanford men. That was my father, Freddie Sanford. They call him Fred Sanford. Yes, Fred Sanford. Yep. My middle brother was standing behind us, and my older brother is the one who took the photograph. This is on our farm, our little farmhouse outside of Como, Mississippi. And yes, indeed, that is an outhouse way back in the back. This was the center of my life for the first 19, 20 years of my life. My family, since we lived on a farm and was kind of isolated, my family was my life. My mother and father, two wonderful people. My 6 brothers and sisters were my role models. They taught me, they nourished me, they took care of me, they spanked me, and gave me what I needed to try to be successful in life. And I went to segregated schools, of course, until my senior year of high school, when it was finally time to force integration, about 16 years after Brown versus Board of Education. But again, that picture sort of represents my life as a young boy growing up on a farm with cotton and chickens and hogs and cattle, milking cows, and doing all of the work that a farmer would do, but also dreaming of an existence away from the farm. And I did that pretty much all of my young life. And by the time I got to be about 11 years old, that existence revolved around writing. I always wanted to write. It was my life's career to be a newspaper reporter. And thank God I've achieved that, and as an editor, and now as a published author. And so that picture just sort of represents the family that sort of sent me on my way. And that is a little spinning top that I have in my hand that I used to carry with me everywhere I went.
One of the common experiences that Otis and I have is a long tenure in the North. And when you're Southern and when you move north, your racial antenna goes up. And you want to know exactly what was going on in terms of race in the North. And both of us experienced this. My first experience with this really was when I went to university at Yale. And I was expecting, hopefully, that there would be a fully integrated, racially integrated classroom. To my surprise, there were 5 African Americans in a class of 1,000. And it happened to be the same time that James Meredith entered the University of Mississippi. So I was the only Mississippian from a majority black area, and I was the center of attention, mostly a target for my classmates. And that led me to develop very much a lifetime interest, both academically and in terms of experience and in terms of programs, an interest in race.
My experience in the North involves primarily Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had been a Southern boy all my life and had lived either in Mississippi or Memphis all my life up until 1987 when my journalism mentor, a guy by the name of Angus McCarran, who just passed away on Monday of this week, broke my heart. He was the editor of the Pittsburgh Press, the last great afternoon newspaper in this country. And he had given me 2 jobs prior to that. And he reached out to me and asked me to come to Pittsburgh to be an assistant city editor for the Pittsburgh Press. I'd never lived out of the South. I almost didn't go, but my lovely wife, who's sitting in the back, Elaine Sanford, convinced me, you take this job. You know what you want to do. And Angus told me, if you come to Pittsburgh, I'll teach you how to be an editor. And so I trusted him to do that. And so, but when I got there, I experienced segregation in ways that I'd never even experienced in Mississippi, believe it or not. That kind of strange thing to say, but it's true. We discovered, Elaine and I, on our first trip, apartment hunting, that people did not want to rent to me. There was one instance where Elaine was making the phone calls, and she has a television voice because she came out of television, so they had no idea what race she was. But when we got there and saw the faces, they started looking like this. That's the kind of experience we had. Pittsburgh is, as wonderful as it sounded, is a very segregated city in a lot of ways. African Americans in Pittsburgh were pretty much concentrated in only 2 or 3 areas of the city. We found our way eventually and found our way to a very integrated neighborhood in Penn Hills, but we were exposed, as Gene says, we were exposed to a different kind of issue with race in that northern or northeastern city of Pittsburgh that I'd never experienced in either Como, Oxford, Jackson, or Memphis, Tennessee.
And we're going to pick up this idea of the mentor later on in terms of the careers that we're going to talk about, because we want to talk about the private sector. My mentor happened to be at Yale, a historian named Robin Winks. Sensed my sophomore year that there was some anxiety, so he took me under his wing and gave me a special tutorial on racial history, economic history, and colonial nationalism, which has led to a lifelong interest. And he morphed into a close associate and close friend. One of the things that Otis and I have talked about is history, and this is a history museum, so this is the history part of that presentation. And we wanted to go back to Reconstruction, because one of the things that interested me was what would happen to the black population in the transition between slavery and freedom. And we've come up with a very, very different interpretation. At first, I thought that Reconstruction after the Civil War was a missed opportunity. And then I began to think about W.B. Du Bois's comment that it was a splendid failure. And then I concluded it was a failure. And most recently, I think of it as a charade. And I wanted to go to the podium and discuss this a little further, because what the missing element was the racial attitudes in the North. Now, the abolitionist or anti-slavery advocates could be both against slavery and also very much anti-black. It sounds like a contradiction, but that was what happened, and that was also the downfall and why I call Reconstruction a charade. The first quote here is from Samuel R. Ward, who was a black abolitionist. And as you can see, he said, white abolitionists best love the colored man at a distance. So we moved to Connecticut, and Connecticut had a gradual emancipation in 1784. In 1800, the state of Connecticut issued a census which asked the following question on Article 27. It said, was a black person born free different from one who was born enslaved in terms of morality and in terms of industry? And I will guarantee you that this very, very important document is not taught in any public school system in Connecticut. And as you can see, this is the president of Yale, Timothy Dwight, anti-slavery, abolitionist, etc. Free blacks this came out in 1811, are generally neither able nor inclined to make their freedom a blessing to themselves. They have no economy and waste, of course, much of what they earn. They have little knowledge either of morals or religion. They are left, therefore, as miserable victims of sloth, poverty, ignorance, and vice. Now, the implications of this are that Connecticut at this point had a black population of 2%. 2%. Connecticut disenfranchised, at this point, its black population of 2% and created a colonization society which was there to eliminate its black population. Connecticut is very proud of one of its citizens, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was very significant in terms of the Civil War. And there is her house is now a historical society in Hartford, Connecticut. So we know what she thought about, Harriet Beecher Stowe thought about slavery. What did she think about black people? She sent the heroines and heroes of Uncle Tom's Cabin to Africa. And she said there would be no reparations. They didn't want them. Frederick Douglass, one of the giants of black history, said, "Madam, we are here, and we are here to stay." Now, this is something that really needs to be described in terms of American history. Racism comes in many forms: a slur, discrimination, violence, or exclusion. Now, this is exclusion. This is the Oregon State Constitution of 1857. At that point in time, Oregon had 52,000 people, of which 100 were black, and yet they wanted an exclusion clause. So this was something that swept across America. Historians are generally proud of the fact that the old Northwest territories had a prohibition of slavery. What they didn't know, what they don't talk about, is that Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois also had black exclusion laws, as well as there are examples of abolitionist Massachusetts turning down refugees during the Civil War who were going to be sent to Massachusetts. The hero of the movie Glory, John Andrew, the governor of Massachusetts, said, "No, we don't want them. They'll end up as paupers." In triumph of American history, of course, is the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. What bill did Lincoln sign the day before? An appropriation bill to colonize blacks on an island off the coast of Haiti. So you're getting this exclusion. Now, what did this mean in terms of Reconstruction? This is the New York Times, and the New York Times is not terribly proud of this. This is just before the Civil War ended, and it was about cotton. And we need to get cotton back into production. What does that mean? It means white ingenuity and enterprise ought to direct black labor. And then there's this other sign of northern attitudes in terms of racial inferiority, that the black person must live for centuries next to the white person, the superior white person, a few rising to the level of equality. So there was always room in the white psyche for black elite. Now, what that meant was that there was a containment policy of keeping blacks in the South directly or indirectly. And there was only one attempt at a mass migration north, and that was in 1878. This is the harbor in Vicksburg, where very bad cotton crops and oppression and a lot of hype in terms of publicity for land in Kansas caused thousands of blacks along the Mississippi River to want to move to Kansas. Kansas said, "No, we don't want them." So between 1865 and 1914, the black population of the North stayed under 2%, while 18 million white immigrants came in. That was no coincidence. This only changed because of another economic event. I'm a bit of an economic determinist. And that was World War I. World War I, what happens in a war? Industry booms, unemployment goes from 8.5% to 1.5%, and there's no white immigration. So that's the beginning of the Great Migration North. Now, what this means in terms of us today is that and also in terms of what happened during Reconstruction, there were 1 million men in uniform in the Union Army in May of 1865. This dwindled to a few thousand by 1876. Even the civil rights legislation that was passed in many ways for expediency's sake. The radical Republican George Boutwell from abolitionist Massachusetts said, if blacks have their right in the South, they will not move north. Even Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, abolitionists, they feared a black migration north. So this led to, this is a very interesting calendar about Mount Bio in 1910. So this was the attempt by blacks to create a separate self-sufficient racial economy, which is impossible. So there has to be integration, there has to be mainstream, which is one of the themes of the book, and one of the themes that Otis and I talk about is how to get a mass of black America into the economic mainstream. But look at this: religion, industry, education, finance, power. What you can't see that was blocked out in terms of this image is that there was a whole industrial base, particularly that was advocated by Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, that blacks would build their own economic self-sufficient community. It doesn't work because there was no infrastructure there. You have to be part of the mainstream. And I theorize that what happened created 100 years where racial mores in the North and in the South hardened. In the North, what you got were race riots and ghettos. In the South, what you got was overt legal segregation and violence. So this critical period of Reconstruction actually failed miserably in terms of doing that. It made the 1960s much, much more difficult. And the transition in the 1960s was, as we know, was clearly not complete. But this is part of American history that's not recognized in terms of the negative features that it brought about.
Mm-hmm. Right. And one other point that I think is very significant here, and Gene touched on it, was, even the national news media, the media that paints itself as very open, very liberal, had its own limitations when it came to issues of racial equality, racial desegregation, and that quote from the New York Times is a classic example of that. My own newspaper, the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, has an absolute sordid history when it comes to racial fairness. They were absolutely, the editors were openly hostile to any racial integration, to African Americans voting. My book, Boss Crump to King Willie, focuses on the fact that Boss Crump ran the city of Memphis for 50 years with the African American vote. But the newspaper, the Commercial Appeal, detested that political machine and openly said that African Americans did not deserve the right to vote. And it's an interesting footnote in history that the managing editor who was leading that charge and I held the same position at that newspaper, which is hopefully an interesting footnote.
This is the legacy behind me of Reconstruction, which in 1964, not many people know about this. New York doesn't talk about it much, but there was a boycott of the New York City school system. 464,000 African American students and Hispanic students boycotted the New York City school system because of an inferior school education. In 1966, it was understood that you could not integrate the New York City school system. They're still trying to integrate it unsuccessfully. And then the second photo is, of course, to remind everybody of the Watts riot in 1965. And what came out of this was the Kerner Commission report, which it's the 50th anniversary, so you see these things revisited, except that I'm going to revisit the revisits in terms of what they left out. And one of the statistics that came out in the Kerner Commission report, which was 605 pages, was who were the people, the participants in this riot. And interestingly enough, 65 to 70% of the participants were not Southern migrants. They were the children of Southern migrants who were radicalized in the anonymity of an urban city in the north. So you move from farm to city, and in the farm there was an extended family, which was the black community. In the city you didn't have that. So you ended up with these massive race riots. Now, to move on to the career situation, which is very interesting in terms of what was available in terms of opportunity for black people. We saw that the exclusion was manifest in the Mount Bio calendar. W.B. Du Bois did a very interesting study in 1903 when he wrote about the talented 10th. And how he did it without computers, I don't know, because we still can't do it or we don't want to do it. So he selected 2,000 black college graduates. And here's what the professional alternatives were. 54% of those black college graduates in 1903 became teachers. 17% became ministers. And there were only 3% who were actually involved with business. So that is the foundation, and we'll see how that changed, if it changed, today. So let's bring things.
One other quick point before we move on. You mentioned the Kerner Commission, and it plays right into the Du Bois study. The Kerner Commission also painted a picture of the news media and the fact that from that point on, the national news media, especially the print media, needed to try to reflect the makeup of its own communities. A lot of newspaper editors tried to take that to heart, and that sort of led to the beginnings of more people of color being hired at newspapers. I'm a beneficiary of that right here in Jackson at the Clarion Ledger. I am the first African-American male to ever be hired as a reporter at the Clarion Ledger. And it was because there was a young progressive editor named Ray Hederman who understood what the Kerner Commission was saying and moved to try to bring some integration inside the newsroom. Therefore, you can better cover your communities. That's what the Kerner Commission said. They did get that right. But the problem is the news media never reached that goal, because in major cities, they were never able to reflect the entire makeup of that community.
So we might move to a personal point. You became interested in being a journalist at 11 or 12 years old. And how did that impact you? And you've mentioned to me your father's role in that. Right. So you have evolved into a very successful journalist. Now, how did that take place from that period on?
Well, my father, again, who had a sixth grade education, loved newspapers. And so we had the newspaper mailed to our house every 6 days a week. No mail on Sunday, but we had the newspaper coming, and I just poured into the paper. Because he was a farmer and he was a carpenter on the side, and he didn't have time to read the paper, so he told me to read the paper for him. And he could read, but he wanted me to read it for him and tell him what was going on, especially in the world of sports. And so I just poured into and it was the Commercial Appeal. And I told him about it. I gave him more information than he ever wanted to know about it. I gave him the score of the Cardinals games, and I gave him the score of the Dodgers games, because he loved the Dodgers. But then I found my way to the news pages, and I was just fascinated by the politics of Memphis, even the social life of Memphis, and I certainly was struck by all of the issues around race that was going on in the city of Memphis. Again, this was leading up to the mid-1960s and into, of course, 1968 with the sanitation strike and the assassination of Dr. King. That fueled my interest in journalism that never wavered from the time I was 12 years old, and I'm happy to say it does not waver today.
And as a journalist, I can tell you that he knows how to ask a tough question because he asked them to be all.
I've asked you
all
tough ones.
I took a different path. I was curious, so I ended up living around the world, 15 years overseas, which was a long way from Sunflower County, Mississippi. Probably the most interesting experience that I had was living in Japan for 9 years, and there I was a small minority in a very successful economy. In the 1980s, it was the first non-white, non-Western nation to challenge America economically. And I hired hundreds of Japanese. So for me, living in an environment where there was a totally homogeneous population, very hierarchical, 180-degree opposite from the U.S., and I witnessed the strengths and the weaknesses of a homogeneous society, which are coming to bear in terms of today's economics. So when we get to the 1960s, there's this one anecdote. My professor of Southern history was named Stoughton Lynn, and he was the most radical professor in America at the time. He led the 1964 education part of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And I'm still in contact with him. And I interviewed him a few years ago for a full day about the educational experience in Mississippi and what he thought the legacy was. But this anecdote, I think, really resonates today. Before he went to Yale, he taught at Spelman College in Atlanta for 2 years. In 1962, he started his course in a survey of American history with the example on the left, the Pilgrims in Plymouth Rock. Young black women's hands go up and they say, "What's that got to do with us?" So then the next year, 1963, he opened with the Amistad slave revolt. Hands go up again. "Why are you treating us specially?" So there is the identity issue that is still prevalent within the African American society. This ambivalence of being different and being part of something. Right. So all of this involvement in the financial area gave me an interest in numbers, and I thought I would bring things to date in terms of the areas that Otis and I are interested in. One of which is economics, and one of which is education. Where are we today, 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement? Home ownership, 41% in terms of the black community, 71% in terms of the white community. The poverty level in terms of blacks and whites has remained the same, 3 times that of the white community. And also, here's a startling statistic that only 2% of the businesses in America that have paid employees are owned by black people. And the number is much, much higher for Hispanics, and of course, much, much higher for the white population. Between 1986 and the present, the net worth of a white white family is up 84%. That's 3 times faster than that of a black family. And this is through Democratic and Republican administrations. In terms of education and in terms of family structure, 65 to 70% of all black children under 18 are raised in single-parent families. Education-wise, the numbers are not good. 56 to 60% of all black high school graduates need some form of remedial education. The United Negro College Fund and the ACT testing organization use 4 different categories: reading, writing, well, actually 5: reading, writing, science, math, and English. And only 10% of high school graduates, black high school graduates, were college ready in 3 out of the 4 topics. You know what the college graduation rates are in terms of the black community. For black males, it's 31% for 6 years. Now let's move back to the Du Bois statistics in terms of professions. Georgetown does a study that brings this up to date. 40% of black college majors are either in community service or social work. In terms of the higher paying jobs, finance, engineering, computer science, et cetera, the range is from 5 to 7%. There are 20% of black college majors in the healthcare area, but they're in the administrative area, the lower paying jobs. They're not in big pharma or STEM. So when you look at this 1903 study to this 2015 study, you see that there's a racial income gap that's built in to this structure.
Right. And as someone who, my title at the University of Memphis is the Hardin Chair of Excellence in Economic and Managerial Journalism, sort of stretching out beyond journalism. I thought about, and Gene and I have talked about this issue quite a bit over the last few years, really. And it is one of those critical issues where there has to be some institutional changes, institutional movement toward getting African Americans into the broader spectrum of economic life in this nation. We talked the other day about the fact that a lot of government institutions, even school systems, school districts, a lot of African Americans, if you're in a heavily African American populated area, will see those systems as job creators, because that is the real opportunity to get a decent paying job and moving ahead. The private sector has been much slower to embrace the broader diversity issue than the public sector has been. And so in Memphis, for example, there's this continuing push to have the local governments do more, have more diversity in its contracting as a way to hopefully spur entrepreneurship among minorities and African Americans. Sometimes that brings about some friction and political strife, but it is absolutely necessary in order to bring those dismal numbers, I might add, to a more respectable level. And again, where education is concerned, in Memphis, for example, at the University of Memphis, we have a very racially diverse student body. But even there, the concentrations are somewhat typical. A lot of African Americans are in healthcare, are in nursing, and not in some of those other areas, technology, that I think leads to a better opportunity.
Yes, and the push, interestingly enough, in terms of getting African Americans into the private sector came without government prompting in the 1960s, when the major companies, General Motors and Citicorp, and at the time Controlled Data, Xerox, all were attempting to hire African Americans. What Otis and I have talked about a lot is the pipeline. Right. And Otis, he's going to comment on this because Otis has been in a position to hire people for decades now, and even at the University of Memphis, he's in that position. So he can talk to you a lot about that pipeline. One thing in terms of, that I wanted to mention that really needs to happen And I think that the best place for it to happen at this point is at the college level, because it's so very, very difficult in America, North and South, to have a fully integrated secondary school. So the best place to have this interface among racially diverse groups is in college, and that actually worries me at this point because it's not happening. The word that I want to get to now is familiarity, and there's a lot of talk about unconscious bias. So I went to a lecture given at my reunion at Yale, taught by a psychologist at Yale about unconscious bias, and he was putting all of these graphs, many graphs, more than people that could absorb, on the screen. And finally, at one like this, there was the white doctor and the black patient. So finally, I had to stop him. I said, "Sir, was this the first visit?" And he was talking about lack of trust. And he said, "Yes." And then he was moving on. And I raised my hand again, and I said, "What happened after subsequent visits?" And he said, "Oh, the lack of trust dissipates." So there's a simple word, it's called familiarity, that's very, very impactful in terms of virtually every aspect of American life. One of the things that bothers me in terms of colleges now, this an obstacle, is you're beginning to see something like the early 1970s. At the Ivy League schools now, they have symbolic separate graduations in terms of ethnic groups and also other groups. And sometimes people don't even stay for the real graduation. You're beginning to see at various places self-segregated dorms. And also the ethnic communities on campus, whether it's the Black Student Union and Hillel, the Jewish group, they take a much larger role and become the center and focus of a student life. And that prevents this very, very important social network that has to occur before you get this familiarity that I'm talking about. And in terms of where we are with corporate America at this point, they are aggressively seeking African American employees. The question is, once they're hired, what are the progress areas? So Otis has had a lot of experience in terms of this pipeline and what happens to people once they're hired, right, from the media standpoint.
Absolutely, and from the media standpoint and from that traditional educational standpoint. And my desire, my caution, my urging is that our secondary educational institutions have to get better. They have to prepare students. They have to force students to step up their game long before it's time to go to college. Beginning to deal with thinking about careers and thinking about preparation to join, especially the private sector workforce and big companies, when you get to college, that's way too late. We have to do a better job of preparing, of educating our kids, starting in the elementary schools. And certainly by middle school, they need to be thinking about where they want to take themselves. That's a difficult thing, but it is a necessary thing, because by the time that pipeline shrinks tremendously when I'm there on a committee trying to decide about someone being an assistant professor in public relations, or an assistant professor in advertising, or an assistant professor heading for a tenured track position in our department or on our campus. It is critical that we do a better job at the secondary educational level.
And the social issues that get involved, and Otis and I talk about this a lot, there's the building blocks of society that occur before the educational system, which are family structure, which are the community, and also the church.
The church.
And the church has to get, particularly in the black community, has to get more involved in this situation, and the family structure has to be repaired in that context. And before we open it up to questions, Otis and I don't use a manual for racial communication to talk to each other. It's a matter of, and we don't have a facilitator, and we don't have a conflict resolution person. It's a matter of universal norms. And those norms are civility and respect and a knowledge base and listening and questioning. And that's how things need to operate in terms of a one-to-one open conversation.
And I would add one other word: acceptance. Jean has accepted and has an understanding of my background because we were on parallel tracks. We call ourselves the parallel kids sometimes, because he was going on this parallel in Sunflower County as I was going on a different, very different parallel in Panola County, not that far away from each other, but really in different worlds. But we understand each other. We know where we came from, and we have the kind of relationship that we have now because of that experience. And we would be more than happy to take any questions that you all might have. Thank you so much.
If you'll raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone and you can ask your question.
I would like to know the thesis of each of your books. What is the thesis of your book and the thesis of your book?
Very briefly, the thesis of mine is the political evolution of Memphis, Tennessee, from the two most significant political figures in the history of the city. On one end is E.H. Boss Crump, who ran the city for 50 years with the African-American vote. Boss Crump was from Holly Springs, Mississippi, came to Memphis. On the other end is the first elected African-American mayor, who was Dr. Willie W. Harrington, who was a native son of Memphis and became the longest-serving mayor of Memphis. So the book chronicles the political history of Memphis and this 100-year fight, most by African-Americans, for political inclusion to elect that African-American mayor in 1991.
And the reason I wrote this book is it's a culmination of 50 years of interest and personal involvement. And the focus of the book is to get a mass of African Americans into the economic mainstream. And why it's a failure is because America has failed to assimilate its black population into the mainstream. And I had to do it from a historical perspective. There wouldn't be a doorstopper. It had to be around 300 pages. And I wanted to move people from the past to the present to show the linkage between the past, the present, and the future.
I saw it. I think he's controlling it there.
Hi. So you said a whole bunch of stuff. Some of the stuff I agreed with, some of it I didn't, but that's for another conversation. I spent my early career, I'm from Vicksburg, product of the public schools. I went to undergraduate school at Southern University in Baton Rouge, law school at the University of Maryland. I came of age when Ronald Reagan was president, finished law school then, and that cut off a whole lot of opportunities in terms of the things that I'm interested in. I say that to say my first professional job was running a nonprofit called Inroads. We placed minority college students in internships with major corporations and did a wonderful job across the country and across the globe because there was a commitment from corporate America to bring in diverse people into it. And then the economy bombed. And that commitment went out the door. So given your premise, right, when the economy bombs, people get insular and don't appreciate differences. So how do you reconcile expanding the economy to be more inclusive of people who are different when the economy bombs, and our economy will bomb on a regular cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. Did everybody hear it? Okay, and the prerequisite for any sort of improvement is an economy that's robust. And it's not that people forget about it, it's that there are no jobs available. So the critical factor on the national level is fine, but it has to take place on a local level as well, which means that the economy of Pittsburgh is now much better because of a few industries. It's basically transitioned from a steel town to other things. New York, for example. New York, one would think to be in good shape. But look at the lopsided part of the economy. And this, we get into different industries at this point in time. 40% of the tax base of New York comes from the financial sector, the villainized financial sector. It is an unequal, the most income inequality of virtually any city in America. Its school system is totally segregated, et cetera. So you have this lopsided economy. Look at San Francisco. Once you get into economies, you have to look at particular industries and you have to look at particular location. Nashville, booming. Memphis, not booming. But your premise is absolutely right. The assimilation process and bringing people into this job market in the private sector is predicated on a robust economy, both locally and nationally. And there's one other factor here. There's one other factor that Otis and I have talked about, we may do something about it, is that the world that we grew up in is very different from the world that a college kid is going to grow up with now, and that state and local budgets. Many of these budgets are structurally different. New York City, for example, this 36% of its $82 billion budget is fixed. That means legacy entitlements, which is pension funds and debt service. Chicago is bankrupt for all this. So one of the things that we need to talk to students about and make them aware of is exactly the kind of budget world that they're going to move into, because there's going to be less and less of government flexibility in terms of schools and infrastructure, as well as the famous global competition.
I'm like the other lady that spoke. I agree and disagree because some of your information is not true. But I graduated in 1959 in the state of Mississippi. Went to Iowa to a private college, making A's and B's, never a C, from 1959. And I was in social work through the health department for 45 years. So I don't know if the schools in North Mississippi can be compared with these schools, but my sister graduated from these schools 2 years later and went to the University of Missouri, made A's, came out as a nurse, and went straight to supervisor. She didn't stop at being a nurse, she went to being a supervisor. So some of it is true and some of it is not. And we had a community that was unknown. You didn't know that we had the community because how we went north, because the uncles and aunts, you lived together. You ate together, you slept together until you could be on your own. Mm-hmm. And once you were on your own, you went and you purchased wherever you wanted to live. Mm-hmm. That's how we did it.
And I think that was typical of a lot of people. My family was the same way. I mean, my sister went to Chicago, and my brother joined her, lived with her, until he could get out on his own, and he wound up a vice president of CTA, Chicago Transit Authority. I don't think that what we're saying here is a generalized statement here. I think what we are saying is that there are, for institutional reasons and unconscious bias reasons, and even you can blame institutional racism, those things have been a stumbling block. They have not been a stumbling block for everyone. They were not a stumbling block for me. and my family. Obviously, it wasn't a stumbling block for you and wasn't a stumbling block for you. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Well, I mean, well, when I say stumbling block, I mean it didn't stop you. It did not stop you. Obviously, it did not stop you. And it did stop you.
Okay, but also we're talking about today in terms of enormous amount of economic opportunity for African American college graduates to move into the private sector. And when you look at, you know, the African American population on the south side of Chicago or in Harlem, you're looking at, you're not looking at the promised land.
You're not looking at these because there are a lot of, I have people who live in there who live very good.
They do, but the numbers in terms of New York, which spends $23,000 a year per student, are in terms of 3rd through 8th grade, African American kids do it, 25% are at grade level, and that's $23,000. So there are obviously individual successes, but as a mass in that community, it is huge. There's huge income inequality in New York.
I love our question and answer sessions. I think it's one of the liveliest things we have in town. Unfortunately, we have run a little past our 1 o'clock hour. I am certain Gene and Otis will be happy to talk with you afterwards.
Sure.
There are copies of the book for sale in the museum store next door. Help me thank Gene, Dattel and Otis Sanford for today's